He hadn't touched a blueprint in 6 years, because the last time he signed one, a man's spine broke under 11 tons of concrete, and the world decided it was his fault. Eli Vance was on his knees on a warped chapel floor, running a level across a beam that had no business still holding weight, when the site foreman shouted that the new owner had arrived to inspect the renovation herself. Eli didn't stand. He didn't wipe the dust from his jaw. He just said, without looking up, "Tell her the floor's not ready for heels." Nobody laughed. Nobody knew he used to design buildings that made front pages. Before we get into what happened next, and what she found buried in a folder nobody was supposed to open, if you're the kind of person who needs to know how a story ends before you can breathe through the middle, you're in the right place. This is Velvet Storiez Tales, and I promise you, this one earns its ending. Eli Vance fixed things now. Loose railings, cracked plaster, joists that groaned when the wind picked up. He drove a truck with a cracked windshield and packed his daughter's lunch in a repurposed protein tub because the real containers kept disappearing into her backpack and never coming home. Mia was 7, sharp as a tack, and she drew on napkins instead of paper, not flowers, not stick figures, but load-bearing walls with little arrows pointing to where the weight went. She'd learned it from watching him sketch on the backs of receipts, the habit of a man who used to think in structure and now pretended he didn't. He'd changed his last name, technically, dropped the E his father used to spell it with, filed it as a clerical fix, told himself it wasn't hiding. It was hiding. The site he was working was the old Hargrove Chapel, a crumbling Victorian hall the city had condemned twice and saved once, now being converted into an event space by Callaway Development. Eli had taken the contract because it paid on time and asked no questions about the 6-year hole in his resume. He had no interest in meeting the CEO. CEOs asked questions eventually. They always did. Vivian Callaway walked the chapel in low, sensible boots, not heels, which was the first thing that told Eli the foreman had gotten it wrong. She had a hard hat under one arm and a tablet in the other hand, and she was already crouched by a support beam, tracing a hairline crack with 2 fingers, before anyone introduced her. "Who signed off on this joist?" she asked the foreman, not looking up. "That'd be Vance," the foreman said, jerking a thumb at Eli. She looked at him then, really looked, the way people look when they're recalculating something. "This isn't standard code repair. This is load redistribution." She tapped the beam. "You reinforced the whole span instead of patching the crack. That's not cheaper. That's not faster. Why'd you do it that way?" Eli hesitated exactly 1 second too long. "Because patching it would have held for a wedding. Reinforcing it holds for 50 years of them." Vivian didn't smile. She filed it away, the first crack in a story she hadn't known she was reading. She was 32, 5 years into running the company her father built and 3 years into wondering whether she'd inherited more from him than his corner office. Callaway Development had a name for restoring things other people had given up on. Vivian had made it her mission, ever since her father's retirement, to prove the company's foundations, literal and otherwise, were clean. She didn't know yet that clean was the one word that would break her open before this was over. If you're enjoying this so far, the kindest thing you can do is hit follow on Velvet Storiez Tales. It costs nothing, and it means the next one finds you too. Vivian came back to the chapel 3 more times that week, always with a reason that could survive an audit, a materials question, a permit clarification, and always ending up near whichever wall Eli happened to be working. She noticed things. The calluses on his hands were wrong for a man who'd only ever done handyman work. They were old calluses, layered, the kind that came from years of gripping a drafting pencil, not a hammer. He corrected a subcontractor's math in his head, out loud, before the subcontractor had finished the sentence. When she asked where he'd trained, he said, "Here and there," and changed the subject to the water damage behind the choir loft. On a Thursday, Mia came to the site after school because her babysitter's car wouldn't start, and she sat cross-legged in the corner drawing on a napkin while her father worked. Vivian crouched beside her without thinking twice. "That's a really good drawing," Vivian said, and meant it, the girl had sketched the chapel's roof trusses with the load path marked in tiny arrows, the way an engineer would mark it, not the way a 7-year-old should know to. "My dad taught me," Mia said. "He used to build the tall buildings, before I was born. Not fix them. Build them." Vivian's eyes went to Eli's back. He hadn't moved, but his shoulders had gone very still, the stillness of a man who just watched a door he'd bolted shut swing quietly open. "Mia," he said, too evenly, "go wash the chalk off your hands." Vivian didn't push. Not yet. But that night she pulled the county's public engineering registry and searched for Vances, then Vaunces, then every near spelling she could think of, and found nothing, which told her exactly as much as finding something would have. Here's what she didn't know yet, and what you need to hold on to. 14 months before a parking structure on Callaway Development's own Meridian Row project partially collapsed, 6 days before Mia was born, a subcontracted inspection firm called Meridian Testing Solutions filed a rebar certification report that never matched the rebar actually poured into the ground. The gap between what was certified and what was built came to just under $340,000 in cut corners. The engineer who'd flagged the discrepancy in writing, twice, and been overruled both times, was Eli Vance. The man who overruled him, who signed off on Meridian's paperwork instead of Eli's warnings, who was, at the time, Callaway Development's newly promoted director of operations, was Marcus Reyes. He now sat 2 seats down from Vivian at every board meeting. He'd been her father's closest hire. He called her "kid" in front of investors and meant it as affection, and she'd never once questioned why he flinched slightly whenever anyone mentioned the Meridian Row collapse, the one that had put a construction worker in a wheelchair and an engineer named Vance out of the industry entirely, quietly, efficiently, with no trial and no appeal, just a settlement, a gag clause, and a blacklist that traveled faster than any court record. Marcus had built his career on a folder that was supposed to be gone. If you've been following along, you already know the value of catching something before it disappears, which is exactly what the subscribe button does for this channel, so if you haven't yet, now's a good moment. The slow unraveling took weeks, not days. Vivian wasn't reckless with people's lives, even when she didn't yet know whose life she was circling. She started small, cross-referencing old project files as part of a digitization initiative she'd launched to modernize the company archive, the kind of unglamorous administrative project no one questions a CEO for personally overseeing. Her assistant, sorting through a decade of backup drives, found one mislabeled years ago by a departing IT contractor, filed under Property Archives 2016 instead of the deletion queue it should have been routed to. Nobody had ever opened it. Nobody had ever meant to keep it. It had simply survived, the way some truths do, by accident rather than intention. Inside it were 2 versions of the Meridian Row rebar certification. One bore Meridian Testing Solutions letterhead and Marcus Reyes' signature. The other, dated 6 days earlier and never filed, bore Eli Vance's signature and a single handwritten line in the margin: "This will not hold. Do not pour until retested." Vivian read it twice standing up and a third time sitting down. She thought of the man reinforcing a whole span instead of patching a crack, because patching would only hold for a wedding. She thought of a 7-year-old drawing load paths on a napkin, saying he used to build the tall buildings. She thought of her father, 2 years retired, who had trusted Marcus with everything, and she felt something in her chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite rage but sat exactly between the two, waiting to see which one would win. Eli, for his part, had started letting his guard down in small, dangerous ways he didn't fully register. He'd taught Mia to point out load-bearing walls in every building they passed, a game between them, harmless. He'd started arriving early to the chapel, not because the work demanded it, but because Vivian usually got there early too, and there was a particular quiet in the hour before the crew showed up that felt like something he hadn't let himself want in a long time. It was in that hour, on a gray Tuesday, that she finally asked him straight. 14 months before Meridian Row collapsed, Vivian said, not looking up from the beam she was pretending to inspect, an engineer flagged the rebar certification twice in writing. Got overruled both times. I found his letter last night. She turned to face him. It had your handwriting in the margin. Eli went very still, the same stillness Mia had triggered weeks before, except now there was nowhere left to redirect it. I'm not here to ambush you, Vivian said, quieter. I'm here because I think my father's company destroyed your life to protect a man he trusted, and I need to know if I'm right before I do anything about it. You're right, Eli said. 2 words. 6 years compressed into 2 words. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't list his grievances. He told her, plainly, without performance, what it had cost him, his license, suspended pending an investigation that never concluded because Marcus made sure the settlement closed the file first, his name, quietly poisoned across an industry small enough that everyone knew everyone, the year after, when Mia's mother left and he was raising a newborn on savings that ran out faster than shame did. He said it the way a man says something he's rehearsed alone in the dark for 6 years and never once said aloud to another person. Vivian didn't apologize on her father's behalf, because it wasn't her apology to give. She said only, then help me finish what your letter started. Neither of them noticed, in that moment, how close they were standing, or that her hand had found the edge of the beam an inch from his. If a story like this is landing for you, the follow button on Velvet Storiez Tales is right there. It's the easiest way to make sure you don't miss where this goes. What came next moved fast, because Vivian moved fast when she finally had ground to stand on. She didn't confront Marcus in the boardroom, where he had 12 years of built loyalty and a room full of people conditioned to trust his calm. She confronted him privately, in his office, with the original letter, the falsified certification, and the mislabeled drive's file history laid flat on his desk between them. Marcus didn't deny it the way guilty men in movies deny things. He tried something worse, he tried to make it sound reasonable. The deadline was 6 weeks out. Meridian's numbers got us there. Vance's numbers didn't. I made a business decision. A man is in a wheelchair, Vivian said. An engineer lost everything. That's not a business decision. That's a cover-up with a spreadsheet attached. Your father signed the final approvals, Marcus said, and there was the fear in it, finally, the thing he'd been protecting for 6 years. He never read past the summary page. I made sure of that. You want to drag this into daylight, it drags him too. Then it drags him too, Vivian said. I'd rather inherit a company that told the truth late than one that never told it at all. The public reckoning, when it came, wasn't loud. Vivian didn't hold a press conference. She handed the original documentation to Callaway Development's outside counsel and the state licensing board simultaneously, with a public statement that named the failure plainly and named Eli Vance as the engineer whose written warning had been buried. Marcus resigned within the week, ahead of the board vote that would have removed him anyway. The settlement's gag clause, it turned out, protected the company from Eli's silence, not Marcus's guilt, and once the paper trail was public there was nothing left to gag. Eli's license was reinstated within 2 months, his name quietly and then not so quietly restored across an industry that suddenly remembered why it had respected him in the first place. He didn't gloat. He didn't even seem to enjoy it, exactly. 6 years of being disbelieved doesn't undo itself in a headline. What he did, the week the news broke, was drive to the chapel after hours, alone, and stand in the nave looking up at the beam he'd reinforced for 50 years of weddings instead of one patch job. Vivian found him there. She didn't say anything about the board, or Marcus, or her father, who had wept, actually wept, when she told him, and asked only what he could do to make it right, which was its own long conversation for another day. She just stood next to Eli, looking up at the same beam. Mia told me you carved her a little wooden model of this place, Vivian said. Bridge and all, even though there's no bridge here. She asked for one. Eli almost smiled. I told her it wasn't for sale. She said nobody was buying it, Dad, it's a toy. Vivian laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her. Then she looked at him properly, dust in his hair, sleeves pushed up, exactly as unpolished as the day they'd met, and something in her face went soft and unguarded in a way 6 years of careful CEO composure had never quite allowed. You know, she said, tilting her head, the corner of her mouth pulling up, under all that drywall dust, "You clean up like a man who owns the room. You'd make a great bride, Eli Vance. All that patience for detail. All that quiet." It was a joke, mostly, the kind you make to keep your hands from shaking. He huffed something close to a laugh and went back to packing his tools, and neither of them said anything else about it that night. Before we get to how it ends, if this kind of slow-burn justice is your thing, there's a whole shelf of stories just like it waiting for you on Velvet Storiez Tales. Subscribing means you never have to go looking for the next one. 3 weeks later, the chapel finished, restored, structurally sound, booked for its first wedding in 11 years. Eli brought Mia to see it finished, the two of them standing where the aisle would run, and Vivian arrived the way she always did now, without an excuse prepared, because she didn't need one anymore. Mia ran ahead to touch the newly refinished pews. Eli and Vivian stood at the back of the nave, in the quiet hour before anyone else arrived, the same quiet hour that had started all of this. "I put in for a permit today," Vivian said. "New commission. Full restoration of the old Meridian Row lot, turning it into a memorial garden for the worker who got hurt. I want you to design it. Not fix it. Design it." Eli looked at the space where the beam met the wall, the reinforcement holding, invisible now under fresh plaster, doing exactly what it was built to do. He looked at his daughter tracing her fingers along a pew like she was reading the wood's own load path. He looked, last, at Vivian, who had walked into a chapel expecting to inspect a joist and instead had ended up rebuilding the whole foundation of what she thought her life was standing on. "I told Mia the model wasn't for sale," he said quietly, and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out the small hand-carved wooden chapel, bridge and all, its tiny beams reinforced exactly like the real ones now standing over their heads. He set it in her palm and folded her fingers over it, gently, deliberately. "It's still not for sale." Vivian looked down at it, then up at him, and understood, the way you understand a thing your whole chest already knew before your mind caught up, that he wasn't talking about the toy. "You'd make a great bride," he said, low, no joke in it this time, every word landing exactly where the first version had bounced off. "I meant it as a joke once. I don't anymore." She didn't say the 3 words back. Neither did he. She just laced her fingers through his, the little wooden chapel warm between their 2 palms, and Mia's laughter echoed somewhere near the altar, bright and unbothered, the sound of a family finding its footing on ground that had finally, truly, been made to hold. Outside, the late afternoon light came through the newly repaired stained glass and settled gold across the floor, ordinary, unremarkable, exactly the kind of quiet nobody puts on a headline, and exactly the kind neither of them would trade for anything. If this one stayed with you, that's the whole point of what we do here. Come find the rest of them at Velvet Storiez Tales. We'll be here when you're ready for the next.